Welcome to the Insights Unlocked podcast. I'm Nathan Isaacs, Senior Manager for Content Production at User Testing. And joining us today as host is User Testing's Lija Hogan, Principal for Experience Research Strategy. Welcome to the show, Lija.
Thank you, Nathan.
And our guest today is Kate Towsey. Kate is a research ops advisor, coach, and educator. She's the author of Research That Scales and founder of the Cha-Cha Club, a members club for research ops professionals. Welcome to the show, Kate.
It's really great to be here.
All right. Awesome. I am so thrilled to be having this conversation, Kate. And, for a long time, I've been waiting for your book. So I was one of the first people to pre-order it, and I've been sharing it with everyone. And I think really to start the conversation, I would love to hear about your journey, because you didn't start as a research ops manager, but you're now, I think, one of the leading voices, if not the leading voice in the research ops space. And I'd love to just understand, what got you there?
I think like many people who work in an insurance firm, I've heard people, my father is in insurance, and he said, nobody chooses an insurance job or career. You just land there. And I think it's very similar with research operations. I hear from so many people who have started in hospitality, sometimes not even in the operations department of hospitality, but they've been working at the front desk and learning how to engage with people, how to run systems, and then kind of working into other places within hospitality. And then they've found their way through some strange circuitous journey into research operations. And then, of course, you get more direct routes like researchers who actually realize one day it's the systems that I really love. In fact, I want to, they start organizing their own systems and they fall in love with that aspect. And then they do more and more until they're actually doing no more research anymore. And then they get the research ops job title. So my journey was not dissimilar in that I have a background, in fact, in fine art. Very much not related necessarily to research ops, although, and I argue this in the book, it's often mistaken that research operations is an administrative kind of purely logistical job, but it's really a design job. And so I get to express a lot of my creativity in ways in my life in research ops, in the sense of designing systems, of designing culture. Fine art, and certainly the type of fine art that I studied was conceptual art. And the focus of that is all about how do you create the word I'm coming up with is a feelable, a tactile experience for people that shifts how they understand the world. What an amazing definition of what it is to design systems for research, systems for understanding and knowledge. From there, the whistle-stop tour is I worked in journalism. I've even worked as a yoga teacher for some years. I've worked in insurance too. I've done a bunch of things. But things really shifted when I came back from India in 2004, and a friend of mine who had started a small e-commerce store that was selling Vedic books from India. And it was about, I think Amazon had been around for a few years or something. Don't quote me on the exact dates, but it was all pretty fresh. And he said, hey, I would love for you to look after the customer service aspect of my business. And it was perfect timing for me. I remember very clearly he opened his laptop, which was also pretty like a neat thing at that point, laptop, and showed me this new world of an e-commerce CRM, or a CMS. What do you call it for an e-commerce system? The back end.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I was given, eventually I was finding little areas that could be improved to help customers feel more relaxed that their books were arriving and stop them emailing me all the time. And in essence, I started to operationalize his system and eventually operationalize myself out of a job. He didn't need me anymore. And that was really where I started to realize that I actually love systems design. I was then a content strategist. Again, you're working on very similar things, communications, helping people to feel or understand something through how you communicate, not just with words, but where content is placed. Nathan will be appreciating this as I talk, I'm sure, as a content guy. How it's what order it's communicated in, those kinds of things. And then, of course, the systems, the CMS that hold all the content, and systems around recycling content. So I was fascinated by that in the content strategy world. And at some point within that journey, Lisa Rakelt, sort of a remarkable research leader, got in touch and said, I'm working for the government digital service in the UK. At that time, it was Woodstock, an amazing, amazing place to be working. And I want you to come and use your systems content skills to build a research library. And that was really the hook into, wow, there's all these user researchers. I think it was 20 and then 40 and growing team at that point in 2013. That was fairly big, other than the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. And I got down to trying to understand how do people here think about research content? How do you store it? Where do you put it? Realized at some point that I was totally not the right person for the job and didn't have the skills. I really needed a librarian. But I got stuck into building research labs. I built a participant panel that's, as far as I know, used to this day across government in the UK. All sorts of operational type things that made me start thinking about the sort of culture and the communications and the systems that sit behind the world of research. So that was really how I got into it. Now, many people say that if I'd gotten into the loo paper industry, toilet paper industry, I probably would have done it with as much kind of creativity and enthusiasm, because that's just who I am. But I happen to get stuck in the research world.
Well, I think we're all the better for it.
Thank you.
Maybe it's the toilet paper world's loss, but I think a number of things that you said were really resonant for me, and I think the next question really builds on that first one a little bit, because obviously you bring an orientation to research operations of systems thinking. And research operations has, I think, evolved a great deal, especially like over the last several years. And we see it a lot at user testing, right? Like lots of companies scaling, that sort of thing. I would like to ask you more about what are some of the key things that you've seen change, especially recently, and given AI and all the other changes in the tech world that we're seeing, are there some threads you can start to follow up on for the future too?
Yeah, a lot has changed. A couple of primary things is I'm seeing that people I'm a bit of a job description troll on LinkedIn. And over the years, I have used that as a way of marking where the research operations profession is in terms of how people understand it and the types of roles that are being offered. And I've noticed in trolling job descriptions over the last few years that more and more they're really hitting on being more nuanced. So instead of just, you still definitely get these out there, but instead of an endlessly long list of things that not one human being could possibly ever do, not just because it's an extraordinary amount of work that is inhumanly impossible. It is also because there's so much specialism they're looking for someone who's a seasoned librarian, someone who understands how to wrangle data for participant recruitment. They're looking for someone who has a really good grasp of ethics and legal. They're not just looking for someone to come in and be able to speak to these different parties within the organization and direct them in service of research, but they're looking for someone to do all of this work on their own. And more, I'm starting to see those very long, impossible lists become refined in the job descriptions, which is a fantastic thing to see, where people are understanding, I actually need to, as my first hire, not hire a mid or junior level research assistant, which is a very different job to operations. Many people misconstrue or conflate the two, and they're very different jobs. As my first hire, I need to hire a seasoned strategist, a seasoned systems designer who understands research. To be honest, if you can't find yourself a seasoned research operations strategist, someone who's been around the block and has those skills, hire yourself a service designer or a systems designer and give them the briefing, 3 months space to learn about research, and they will do a fantastic job for you. Give them my book, get them to engage with the various communities, the Cha-Cha Club, the research ops community. There's so much out there now. And they will be absolutely delivering gold for you within 3 months. So that's one of the really big things that I've seen, and it's amazing, is that the nuanced understanding by employers, but also within the organization. So when I speak to research ops, professionals, which I do almost all of my life, I'm noticing the conversations are all not just tactical about procuring a tool or doing that very administrative stuff behind the scenes, but they're thinking a lot more about, how do I deliver this tool? How do I embed it or wire it into the system of, or how do I wire it into the culture of research? Not even just the technical wiring of this API or that, which is important, but how do I actually make it work within the organization? And what does it actually do? How does it impact the culture of learning within the organization? That's a massive thing. A quicker list than that, bigger teams. There are more and more bigger teams of research operations. I'm noticing, and I think this has got to do with the sort of shift in the last few years because of the economy, but possibly other reasons, where researchers they used to do all the research. Now, oftentimes what I call PWDR, or powder, designers, product managers, etc. They're doing the very tactical research, maybe not the product managers as much, but the researchers are being called more and more to do strategic research. And the research ops teams are being asked to be the glue between those two spaces. Can you give us the tools we need to and the ability to do all the strategic work, research that is really impactful at the C-suite level? But can you also be enabling everybody else doing tactical research to do a really good job of it? Not just because they've got the tools, but because they've got the training, the support, the understanding, the culture, all those really great things. And then finally, I recently recorded a podcast called It's a Great Research Ops Question. And one of the 6 great questions of research ops that we answered was around reporting lines into research or design and what the differences are. And what was so interesting was the panel of Cha-Cha members on the podcast was saying, it's much more nuanced than that these days. It's not just that a research leader hires a research ops person and that's the end of the story. Very often they're working under different teams, sometimes called creative ops. Sometimes they're working for design. Sometimes research ops are working directly with product managers. And so there's a huge variance in where research ops play these days, which is also an amazing thing to see.
Yeah, and I think, both design and research are really seeing quite a change, quite an evolution. So, and I think we'll continue to see that as things start to reset after the big tech layoff round
Yeah.
too.
And I do think they're resetting at the moment. And I think there's a huge amount of promise and, for me, optimism as to where everybody can land in a really, really evolved and good space.
Well, actually, maybe that's a good point to ask you. So as we start to land in this new space, how do you see research operations really playing a role in like understanding and designing for, great customer experiences?
Ultimately, I think I have to start answering that question with giving a nuanced definition of what research operations is. I believe in the definition that research operations is delivering systems that enable people to engage with, use research. That's fine. But really what you need to do is go back and think, well, what are we actually doing with research? It's very easy for these words and needfully, we need a single word to say something and point at a huge, big thing. But for this, it's you got to question, what are we actually operationalizing, and therefore what value can we deliver? And really, research is about learning and it's about knowledge. And so it's how do we enable researchers to be able to do really effective research as quickly as possible, but effectively with the right people, because they were easy to get hold of. And easy is a very tricky word in participant recruitment land. You should never say easy. I should put a penny in the jar for that. But how can you enable them to really dig in and focus on the right things and get the right research done with the right people? But then after that, a lot of the work is around how do I enable that learning to communicate it in a way and share it in a way that a person receiving it can learn and understand it too. And so that's not just about systems like technical systems to enable to do that or financial systems. It's also about cultural systems, because people will only learn, they'll only take things into their brain and into their central nervous system, and then at some point act on it when they trust it. And so a big part of the work that research operations and research can do, which relates to this, the last few years that we've had in research, is about trust. It isn't just about delivering metrics up to someone and arguing that you are valuable. It's about really developing those relationships of trust, because trust is like the critical foundation to learning. I'm sure, Leah, that you've had experiences where someone tells you some amazing bit of wisdom, but you're just not quite sure if you can trust it because you don't trust them as a source. And so I think that's something, I'm actually not sure if I've answered your question exactly, but I think that's something that we really need to look at. And it's a real area of expansion for research in the current times.
Yeah, and I think, well, I think you answered the question, but
Great.
I think I want to expand on it a little bit more. So good, relief. Um, but it's interesting because one of the challenges that I think a lot of organizations are having is like, who is a researcher? Like
Mm.
who and what can they do? And this kind of relates to the next question that I wanted to cover with you, but it really is like, I think in some specific industries, we see research ops play out a little bit different. We see design play out a little bit different. We see research and product. And you've had a lot of experience across a range of industries, and I'm curious about whether or not you see how research ops plays out differently. And maybe again, no, I'm just really thinking through like, so which industries have been like hardest hit in the rounds of layoffs and all the changes? And I feel like it's kind of been a universal thing, but like, are there any principles that you think are consistent across all the industries, or are you seeing any trends in specific industries around research ops?
I'm not seeing any trends specific to industries. I will say that I'm always working such a broad line on research ops. I don't always get to dig in or see a lot of people in a specific industry to start to take insights from that. Obviously, AI is a really huge thing. And so I am seeing a trend broadly, which is not surprising, where teams are being asked to deliver some AI innovation that's going to alleviate the need for as many headcount and deliver even more impact without hiring more people. That's certainly a trend. I know that people are struggling with that because the companies who have implemented AI, carefully done, not carefully done. Of course, I know user testing, you've implemented AI in your tools. There's still a lack of understanding with the researchers of how do I actually use this? And then again, that word trust comes up. It's a really big question around, can I trust it? I don't believe it's necessarily about, is it going to steal my job tomorrow, but is it going to do a good job, and what parts do I want to keep onto and so hold onto? And so I know there's a lot of research ops folk trying to figure out, how do I deliver on the request that's being given to me to make research really efficient and effective and scalable and all those fancy words with this magic new technology, and yet trying to understand where researchers really touch, whether interaction with AI actually really works for researchers and for the wider organization. And there certainly are very, very good examples that just, it's excavating those examples and being able to spot them more quickly. So that's a big trend. Other than that, in terms of across the industry, the universal principles of systematizing research, a system is specific. If you read any definition of a system, it should really have the word specific in there. Like a universal principle is to come in and really think in terms of what system is specific for this organization, for the culture, to look at which parts of this culture are going to be a long-term thing so that I can build a long-term system for it, and which things are kind of like just this month, next month. At the moment, I feel like we're in tech for sure is usually pretty chaotic, but I think it's in extra states of chaos at the moment. And so it's not to react too quickly to that, to acknowledge we're in an extra state of chaos and I need to keep a system that's going to last beyond the economic turmoil that's around right now. I think the other big universal principle is, which might surprise you, I hope it surprises you, is when you put systems in place that are well designed, they tend to be calming, and they often should create cerebral, like cognitive space to think. One of the greatest, I'm not the first person to say this, of course, but one of the greatest deficits of our time is space to think. When you look at how organizations, including research teams, are being run, by and large, listeners might be going, this is not me, and then well done. But many teams are being run like seat of the pants style, firefighting. Headcount comes in and it's already allocated. There's not a lot of space to really step back and take time to think about what is our strategy, where are we going, and therefore what are the systems that we need more than any other system. And so I think the irony is when you can come in and put systems in place that help to just calm down and create space to think, then you can start to have a space where you get now strategic direction and then a whole lot more clarity in where the organization is doing, why it's doing it, what the priority is, which in turn creates a lot more space to think again. So, these are the things that, again, I think research ops can really, really offer, their leaders. As I said earlier, it's not just research leaders nowadays. It can be product leaders of any kind, is putting in systems that allow everybody within the organization a bit of space to breathe, and therefore space to think, and therefore space to make wiser decisions. So those are, like sort of the universal principles of creating calm and order. Some people have called me the Marie Kondo of research.
I like that. And I also liked your reference to you realized you needed a librarian. So my background, actually, I went to library school originally and ended up here in research. So very much appreciate that.
Yeah. Oh, librarians. If my mantra, if you spot a good librarian, hire them. Don't even think. I've had 2 librarians into when I was running the team at Atlassian. I had one librarian as a librarian, best choice I've ever made. And another librarian popped up and we hired her as well. And she was also an excellent choice. So yeah, you're much valued.
Yeah. Well, that kind of speaks to, I think, a real understanding that bringing real intention to how you organize information in a way that aligns with stakeholders and people who are involved with a project or with the organization in an operational way is really critical. And actually that connects well to my next question, which is around how leaders can really help to plan and create connection, like create that culture with you. Maybe co-create is the best way to say it, to make sure that what the team produces, researchers produce, aligns with business goals and creates an atmosphere of support that's both financial, right? Because you got to get budget to do the work, but then I think also builds accountability and trust.
Yes, I'm passing the question in there. Can I relay it back to you to make sure that I've got it right?
Yes.
So we're talking about, So we're speaking about, actually, I'm going to pause there because there's something that I want to say in response to that, and we'll run with that, and you can let me know if I'm off question. Yeah. One of the things I find intriguing is that anyone who sells something, it's not often especially when you work internally. If you work in an agency, then this would feel a lot more close to home because agencies do sell research. It can be a little more difficult when you work in-house to hold on to the idea that you are in fact selling your research to people all the time. Mm-hmm. But for someone who creates a product, let's go for a bottle of apple juice is an example, or just bottles of juices. Let's go for that. That's terrible. We'll go for the bottles of juice. They will be thinking immediately about, okay, I've got my product, I've got my various kinds of juice. And now I've got to sell it. Immediately, they're going to be thinking about how they catalog the different types of juice, how they put it on the shelf so that it can be easily found within the supermarket, and how it's branded, and the fact that it all looks similar so that it's easy to recognize and find. And they would be thinking through all these product presentation type questions. They might even hire someone to manage the stock and make sure that the shelves are well packed all the time, so that someone walks in, they can just pick up what they want and they can walk out. And yet, in research, we create a product and it is, on a tangible level, it's a research report or a deck or some kind of physical asset of the research or digital asset. You can argue, and I do argue, that the final product is actually that it's in someone's head and nervous system and they can at some point do something with it. Might not be immediate, but they might put together 3 or 4 different bits of information and then suddenly make an amazing decision about something a year down the line, and your job is still done. Hard to measure, but done. And yet, as producers of research, it's not an instinct to hire someone to come in and catalog the vast quantities of product that we create and make it easy to find and highly accessible. That it astonishes me that we don't think through that. What we do typically is hire people to make juice, give them some bottles, and then just let them do whatever, and then wonder why we're not selling as well as we could be. I wish that teams would hire researchers to create product, to create research, trying to get locals around them to use their product, but then also hire someone really early on. Like Lija, you're a librarian, hire a fantastic, innovative librarian to come in and create the shelves and set it all up and make sure that it looks good, it's really findable. And as you create 100 reports in 1 year, and the next year you've got 200 reports or 300 reports, hopefully your team's growing over time. Within 3 years, you could have thousands and thousands of data points that need to be really, really well organized so that you can now have the power of being able to find it all, but also be able to do longitudinal studies across different types of data. It's an incredible power when you get that right. And it does, just to repeat myself, astonish me that that is not standard practice in our profession.
Yeah, yeah, and I feel like you answer the question that I asked in a really like thoughtful way. So thank you
Great.
for navigating that. But I have a
So,
simpler question.
somewhere inside of me, I was
You
getting it.
totally got it. You totally did. In your book, you talk a lot about scaling research. And I know that even the word scaling to some people in the industry right now is, I'll say challenging, maybe is the best word, or
Yeah.
controversial. And I like to ask, what do you think the biggest barriers are that organizations face when they're trying to scale their research ops?
One of the biggest barriers is a lack of strategy. You cannot scale unless you know what you're going to scale. And I cover this a lot in Research That Scales, because you can't scale research. Research is, you could scale the number of reports that you create, but is that really useful? It's such a varied product to create. Now, I did a lot of thinking about what does scaling actually mean in the sort of wider manufacturing world, versus how does that compare to what we're doing in research, and therefore how do you actually scale research? And chapter 1 and 2 really dig into this. Just by the way, often people don't pick up on it, and I like to point it out. I didn't think I'd get away with this because the book's obviously called Research That Scales, and then chapter 1 is called Research Does Not Scale. Systems do. And I thought, is my editor even going to let me kind of play that joke? They did, and I'm very grateful. So yeah, one of the biggest things is just going, well, we're going to scale research, and scaling research means just hiring more researchers to do more research. And then often forgetting about the systems that even sit behind the researchers. Scaling is not just about getting bigger. It's really about progressively delivering greater and greater value for less and less input. And so how do you do that with research? Well, key thing is to have a strategy around what value does the organization want from us, and therefore how do we deliver that value to them? Yes, sure, there might be things that you really believe that the organization should be seeing. There's so many examples of this in companies, and why they're not seeing this. And as researchers who want to really keep putting this under their nose, that they can finally see it and make a move on this, because it's so important. But first and foremost, in order to prove your value, you've got to speak to where everybody is at. What I think is really wonderful is that the skill, the very amazing skill of research and researchers, is to be able to watch and listen and understand what drives someone. What is it that they want in order to make them happy, to satisfy their need? And those exact skills are the skills that are needed to try and understand stakeholders all the way up to the founder or the CEO or whoever. Not just what are they putting in their strategy, we want to now roll out into Canada next year or whatever it is, but to also understand what drives them. Is it stories that drive them, numbers that drive them, a mixture of both? Do they need something regularly reported to them to feel like we're on the right track? Like, what is the character of the stakeholder? What can I understand or infer from speaking to them to try and understand the sort of communications that I can deliver to be able to bring them on board, to, again, get them to trust me so that we can build a relationship over time. That's really, really crucial. I feel like I need to stop there.
Well, I feel like you just really spoke to chapters 1 and 2 at some depth, but those are really, I think, important and foundational thoughts, because I think that scaling often people think means more, and actually what you mean is it means richer. And I think that that's a really important shift in thinking to make.
Yes. I love that you say the word richer, because it is that.
Yeah.
And then also a scalable system is one that can grow. You can have a scalable system that's only looking after 5 people right now, and it's scalable. Just because it's not looking after 500 right now doesn't mean that it's not scalable. If you've designed it so that if tomorrow 5 more people were to pitch up, you know that, well, I'm going to need $50,000 more dollars, 10 hours more a week. These are the proportions of things that I'm going to need to be able to meet the needs of 10 people versus 5 people, because I know what I'm spending right now. And if 15 people pitched up, maybe there'll be an economy of scale and I can slice off 2 hours a week or whatever it is. That's what scalable is. You could have a system that's looking after 500 people, but it's not scalable because if 60 more people pitched up onto those 500 people, suddenly the system starts to break down. So it's really not about size. It's about the capacity to grow with an understanding of the things that are needed to enable that growth. So the other misconception is that it's scalable. It's going to sit here and with the exact same resources I've got today, it's going to be able to look after 50 more people and therefore it's scalable. That's not necessarily the case. It's an understanding of what's needed in order to grow within a certain amount of quantity.
Yeah, I really love that point, and it's an important one to really take to heart. It's not just numbers, yeah. But yeah, and I think another related takeaway is about, I think what you call an RKM strategy, so research knowledge management, right? And maybe you can speak to why it's so crucial, why it's so important, and what are some of the key approaches that you might use to implement it?
So RKM, or research knowledge management, is a term I came up with because knowledge management is a huge field out there already. Like a massive field, and they're doing really interesting work trying to figure out how do organizations make the most of knowledge, and not just research knowledge, but also knowledge to do with onboarding and learning. And when someone walks out the door, how do we retain all of the organizational knowledge they have? And so we're just focusing, not just, it's a massive thing though, we're taking those long held, like thousands of years old librarianship skills and the more modern knowledge management skills and honing them towards the space of research. Again, for the same reasons of knowledge is the primary asset of research. This is what researchers do all day. Unearth knowledge, share knowledge, hope knowledge is embedded into someone's brain and nervous system so that knowledge forces them to act or encourages them to act in a different way at some point or make a different decision. And so one of the big things that I speak about is there are interesting tools in the market these days that are knowledge management tools for research. Many of them are sort of what I call like community of practice type tools. I call them campfires. They're fantastic. They're not a library, and they're not a repository either very often, but they're a fantastic tool. If they're your only tool, you're in trouble if you expect it to do your library as well, and that's often what happens. So a campfire everybody's been around it. I mean, most people would have been around a campfire. But it's a wonderful thing. You gather around a campfire, you maybe have snacks and drinks or whatever. You're telling stories and it's memorable and you're getting to know people. And over the evening, you developed in jokes and in words, and you have a folksonomy of your stories by the end of the day. And they are gathered in your mind and in your being. And hopefully you've had a note taker there in this particular research campfire who's also gathering this stuff into a tool. At some point, the campfire has to break down and everybody walks away and onto a new campfire, a new project. And all of that amazing knowledge walks away with them. And the stuff that is left behind is often just left there. And it's got this weird dialect around it, this folksonomy that no one else really quite understands. Do not shut that down. It's such an important part of learning. And it's a thing that will often involve people socially in your research and in learning. You want to encourage that, and there are amazing tools to do that. The problem is that that kind of social tagging doesn't work when you want to have stuff stored for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, so that it can be reused by people who weren't part of that original language and that original campfire. And this is when you need to move from the bohemian space into something that is owned and managed. It's like Gestapo style, like this is like the building is done like this. No one has entry. There's one person or a team of librarians, if you're that lucky, who's going to set up the taxonomy, and it's structured and it's centralized, and there are rules, and there are, for submitting stuff to the library, it needs to look a certain way, and so on and so forth. It is a very, very different space to the Bohemian campfire. Both are incredibly important because on the one hand, you've got social creation and interaction and memory. It's so powerful. And on the other hand, you've got some stranger 6 months down the line can come to the very structured library and they can ask, I would like to find XYZ about dark mode or whatever. And you can pick up 6, 7, 10, 20, whatever it is, reports all on dark mode because they were all tagged in exactly the same way, not using some kind of niche tribe-like taxonomy around it. should come up with the term tribonomy.
Tribonomy, I
That
like
could be
that.
an alternate to the folksonomy. So that's one of the biggest things I see that organizations are not doing. They're very good at doing the campfire, but and that doesn't have to be run by a librarian necessarily. It's ideal if you have some structures in place, but they're very loose and co-creative. But very few people have actually hired a librarian and have built the actual structured library in a structured library tool.
That's a really interesting point because as you were speaking, we talked earlier about artificial intelligence and what role it could play in this. And so I've lots of friends who are catalogers, and I was just thinking about, free floating subject headings, right? Like, because actually, like, really, it's a thing. We often go back and iterate and change and add and weed, right? That's something that's very much integral to what happens as a librarian. And I'm not sure that LLMs are good at this yet, but one thing that they could do is help to capture, manage, make connections in those large bodies of knowledge, right? That are specifically focused around the drift of the language and the folksonomies or tribonomies, whatever you want to call them. So that's an interesting point.
It is very interesting, and I really am excited to see where we land on the interaction between artificial intelligence and human intelligence, and where each plays its best role. Because I think there is space for both in all lands, and we're just trying to figure out the relationship.
Yeah. So, final question, really. Thank you so much for the conversation again. But what, if anything, did we not talk about that you might want to share with the listeners today?
I always like these open questions. I think one of the things that I see more and more, I do coaching and sort of advisory work around strategy for research ops, which ultimately ends up being a conversation about the research strategy, because without a research strategy, you don't really know what you want to operationalize. You will get so much more out of operations if you're specific, a word that I've used several times about, let's say, participant recruitment. Sure, you can get an amazing tool in place that's just like a blob of participant recruitment of participants. Here's a blob of participants, or it might be a panel that's slightly more oriented towards B2C or whatever. But when you can get really particular about these are the areas that the business is focused on, and therefore we're also focusing on, I'll use the example from earlier, the company's going to roll out into Canada. So we better get good at recruiting Canadians of a specific type. Suddenly you can bring real nuance to the types of recruitment operations you deliver. And so with the limited resources you have, because no matter if you've got a team of 12 or 20 or 25 operations specialists, you will still need to prioritize. They will still have too much to do. It's that fast. Now you can put a team onto, this is an area that we want to get really, really great at. We're going to be able to pick up a Canadian B2C working in the airline industry. Let's just go with that. In like a heartbeat, because we've put effort into that. And so your operations suddenly have focus. So research strategy is huge if you want to make the most of operations. It's critical if you want to scale or make anything that is scalable, which means that then you can work, a research operations strategy out of that. One of the key things that strategy needs, and it's a repetition, it's a worthwhile repetition, is you need to think. You need space to think. Our organizations, all of them, are set up with Slack or Team or email. You've got personal WhatsApps, you've got LinkedIn messages, meetings all day long. There's so much going on that if you don't create time in your calendar, like a fire stop, to step back and give yourself space for a minimum of 3 days a quarter. I used to do a week, a quarter. You will never get to the place where you can have the clarity of mind without all the interruptions and noise to actually think for yourself and try and see the wood for the trees and figure out what you're going to do next. It's the biggest investment that you can make for yourself, is just to take that time out and find some kind of cadence that works for you. Finally, I often hear people saying, I could never do that. I could never take 3 days out. And I often say, well, what happens when you get knocked down by the flu? You might be out for 4 or 5 days, or even 2 weeks if you get really ill. And the world carries on, and you come back to work and you pick up, and maybe you've got more emails for a few days, but you get going. It's a pre-planned strategic flu, and you block your calendar out a quarter before, and everybody knows that that's just what you're doing. And I promise you that you will get value out of that.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. So thank you for sharing that. So again, I really enjoyed our conversation and want to make sure if someone does want to buy your book and learn more about you and what your work is, kind of focused on these days, how does one go about doing that?
Great, thank you. You can go to my website, katetowsey.com, and under book, you'll see the 2 links there. Otherwise, Rosenfeld Media, basically Google Rosenfeld Research That Scales, it will pop up. And Amazon, search in Amazon, and it will pop up there as well. So those are the 2 places you can buy it.
All right, that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
It's been a joy, Leah. Thank you so much for the conversation.